Today, one of the men that God is moving through is here with us today, Dr. Skousen. It is a wonderful pleasure to introduce Dr. Skousen to you. He has written several books, The Naked Communist and also The Naked Capitalist, founder of the Freeman Institute. And I could go on with accolades to Dr. Skousen and the wonderful work he's done. But the most important thing is to hear from Dr. Skousen. So bless your hearts. He's going to tell you about this country's beginning, the founding fathers, and many of the things that's on his heart. Let's give Dr. Skousen a hand.
Thank you. This is a beautiful Sabbath day here in Southern California. I want to tell you, I have many thoughts of thanksgiving in my heart as I address you here. One of the most grateful feelings that I have is the privilege of worshiping with you this morning and being invited by Pastor Hinkle to share your spirit as we talk about something which we all have in common, the basic roots of the great American heritage and the founding fathers that produced it. You know, I was not born in the United States. Maybe I have a very special feeling of appreciation for this country because I've had to see so many other countries in my lifetime. I've lectured and traveled in 44 different countries, and I always come back to the United States with a prayer of special thanksgiving that I was able to raise my family of 8 children in this wonderful land. I love America, and I think God has blessed it with great attributes, not only wonderful resources, but He's gathered us here from all over the world, from different nationalities and ethnic groups, where we can sit together as brothers and sisters, worship the God of our fathers, and express our appreciation for the great blessings that have come to us. You know, I think today those who have known the horrors of war would especially appreciate the fact that we're living in a period of peace. I think those that have escaped from beyond the iron and the bamboo curtains, the hostages that have come forth, I think they would have a special prayer of thanksgiving to God for freedom. All of us feel that we are grateful to be free, but those who have lost their freedom especially appreciate having regained it again. You know, Alexis de Tocqueville was a French judge, and he came over to the United States back in the 1800s, and he looked around. He spent a couple of years, as a matter of fact, going up and down the country, interviewing the people, and when he was through, he said, "America is great and is becoming the hope of the world. And the reason she is great is because her people want to be good. And America will be great as long as she is good, and if she ceases to be good, she will cease to be great." Now I want to talk to you this morning about a man who believed in the goodness and the greatness of the United States and spent all of his life trying to establish it so that we in our day could preserve it. This man was born 249 years ago today, the 22nd of February, 1732. Nearly everybody knows this man by name, George Washington, but you would be amazed how few people have ever had an opportunity or taken the opportunity to sit down and read the life of this man. And I can assure you it's exciting. Maybe I would have been so, what should we say, imbued with watching television on sports or some other things that I wouldn't get around to reading him, but I'm a college professor. I have to read these things in order to know what to tell my students. And maybe I was forced into it in the beginning, but I want to tell you, I've learned to appreciate and love this man that we know by the name of George Washington. Now, you know, there were a few men got together a few years ago to try and destroy the impression, the heroic images of our founding fathers. And they began to overemphasize any frailties that they might have had. And if they didn't have any frailties, they went to the trouble of manufacturing some. They actually made up stories about them. But research has caught up with those people now, and we have books that have disclosed the fallacy of their contentions, so that once more our founding fathers are coming forth in their original heroic image that they deserved. Not that they weren't human, and not that they didn't have problems like you and I have. Some of them had even greater problems. But they overcame them, and they did what was necessary. There weren't very many of them, really. They stood together and did what was necessary to make us the first free people in modern times. I remember one of the writers said, Washington claimed he was not going to ask for any salary while he served as our general and our commanding officer during the Revolution, but he turned in an expense account for $500,000. And in his book, he had all the accounts listed. You know what that man had dishonestly done? Changed the figures. He had George Washington asking for about $500,000 when he actually only asked for his real expenses, which were $54,000. Why would people dishonestly do that to such a great man? I've decided it is because they don't want us to believe in these men anymore. They want us to believe in a different kind of culture, a different set of values, and different heroes. But I've spent my life studying both their heroes and ours, and I'm willing to state that the record is very clear now. The great men that God raised up in this land to give us our freedom, our Constitution, were worthy men and good men. As a matter of fact, one of the foremost authorities on George Washington, Dr. Douglas Freeman, says, after all these stories that were told about the founders, and especially George Washington, we're finding that George Washington turned out to be a life of principles and right conduct. These prevailed in his life. There is no echo of scandal in his life, no hint of a breach of accepted morals. Just the opposite of what a lot of these people had alleged. So I say to any of my friends and my students in college, if you've heard these charges against the fathers, the founding fathers, check them out. The research that's being done in Yale and elsewhere has shown that they were good men as well as great men. And this can be certainly said of Washington. Now, the Bible says in Isaiah chapter 51, verse 1, that every so often we should look to the rock from which we were hewn and to the pit from which we were dug, that we might better appreciate the greatness of that which went before us, and so that we can establish ourselves in the same principles that made us great in the first place. And that's really what we are hoping to do this morning in the few minutes that I will be talking to you. When Washington was born in 1732, Benjamin Franklin was living up in Philadelphia. He was already 26 years old and a well-established printer. Up in Boston, or near Boston, was little Sam Adams, and now 10 years old. Another great leader of the time would be born 3 years later, and that's John Adams. 11 years later, Thomas Jefferson would be born, and 19 years later, James Madison would be born. Now, these are the 5 men, so far as I'm able to tell, who did more to structure our independence and our Constitution and our principles of government than all of the rest of the founding fathers combined. All of them made their contributions. But every American should read the biographies of these 5 men because, by and large, they were the leaders. Washington was a big man, about 6'4", almost tall enough to be a good varsity basketball player. He had big wrists and large ankles. He was a big-boned child. As when he was born, they even commented on it. And he grew until, at his prime, he was 6'4". When he died at the age of 67, they measured him just to be sure he was that tall. And at that time, he was 6'3". 3.5 inches. And so he probably had gone down maybe a half an inch, but he was a big man. He was like Abraham Lincoln, except Lincoln was rather a frail person. That is, he was slender, 180 pounds. But both of them had great spirits. People said that his hands were among the largest and strongest they'd ever seen on a person. He'd spent most of his life on the frontier. He was a good horseman. He had worked hard all of his life, just as his father did before him. He loved to get in an Indian dress like the Indians did, just the moccasins and suit made of skin, tassels, and go out into the wilderness, and that's where he did a lot of his surveying, a lot of his work. He was a rugged type of individual. The two men that influenced Washington the most were his father, who was just about as big a man as he was, and his older brother, Lawrence. Both of these great men died before Washington reached maturity, but they had a great influence on his life. They had both attended a school, the Appleby School in northern England, and that's where they had been taught discipline, excellency in performance, high character, high morality, an appreciation that God reigns in the heavens and that he loves his children and that he has great aspirations for his children here upon the earth. They say that Washington stood as straight as an arrow, straight like an Indian, they said, who prided themselves in standing erect and strong. That was Washington. The two men that he loved, his father and his older brother, are said to have put a ramrod down his spine that gave him the courage that was later so necessary at Valley Forge and elsewhere, when very often he stood almost alone with just a handful of men supporting him, and the rest of the country thought everything was lost. That's the kind of a man George Washington was. Well, when he was 14, he heard about something miraculous that had happened up in Boston. You know, the founding fathers had a sense of divine destiny for the United States. They didn't think this was just any ordinary country. They believed with all their hearts that God was about to do something magnificent here. As Bishop Berkeley had said in Ireland, that this was the great new movement that God intended to launch for the benefit of mankind prior to the ushering in of the millennium. Bishop Berkeley in Ireland said, it's probably not going to start in Europe. It's probably going to start in America, where religion is open and free, and where the lives of the people are open and free. There's where God can inspire mankind to rise to his highest and best level. So here's what Washington heard had happened when he was 14. It seems that France had sent over 100 ships to burn Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. And when they heard how many thousands of troops were on these ships, they knew there was no chance to defeat them. So what did they do in Boston? A lot of people wanted them to run to the Great Lakes and start all over again. But Father Adams said to his young son John, when my grandfather was here, the enemy came. My grandfather stayed and fought, and the enemy went away. When my father was here, the enemy came, and he stayed, and my father fought, and they went away. And when the French come this time, I'll be here. But he knew that they didn't have the arms to defeat so strong a force, so do you know what they did? They stacked their arms and went into fasting and prayer and met at their respective churches. And a very exciting thing happened that I suppose came as a great and amazing surprise to everybody. It was a beautiful sunshiny day, and the minister that was going to give the 1-hour prayer at the Old South Church had it sort of written out so he'd be sure and say everything he wanted to say to the Almighty in this terrible moment of terror. At the close of this 1-hour prayer, he said, if I can put it to the best of my memory, O God Almighty, let the breath of thy nostrils move out across the sea and sink these frigates that come to murder men, women, and children and destroy our commonwealth in the wilderness. Sink them to the bottom of thy seas, O God. And that's as far as he got. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, on a bright sunshiny day, a great cloud of darkness descended over the whole region. The wind blew so hard that it rattled the panes in the windows. It blew so hard that the great iron bell in the belfry bonged twice. They could hardly believe it. Minister opened his eyes. He looked around, and then he said, "Oh God, we hear thee, we hear thee." And then he thanked God for the blessing that had come. It was a week before they knew what had happened. Practically the whole fleet of nearly 100 ships had been wiped out. Only a few had survived and gone down into the West Indies. The admiral had destroyed his own life. So had the vice admiral. They were so overwhelmed with the disaster of what had occurred. And the writer, Mary Drinker Bowen, Catherine Drinker Bowen, who records this in the life of John Adams, said, "All New England fell on their knees to thank God for saving them." Boston was not burned. New York was not burned. Philadelphia was not burned. Charleston was not burned. Washington never forgot this. He said, "We are closer to God than we know. We're involved in something much bigger than ourselves." He would declare fast days for his troops. 67 times during the Revolutionary War, he wrote to Congress and said, "Had it not been for the intervention of the Almighty God, we would have been destroyed." Now, this gives you just a little bit of background on the greatness of this man. He ran an 8,000 acre plantation. It was probably the most prosperous and productive plantation in all of America. Whenever any products, farm products, etc., arrived in Europe from Mount Vernon, they brought a premium price because he always went for quality in his products. He was a member of the House of Burgesses for the state of Virginia. And when King George began to be stubborn about imposing taxes on them illegally, he was in the First Continental Congress to plead with the king to recognize that they wanted to be faithful, they wanted to be loyal, they didn't want to be treated as though they were not genuine citizens of England. And he was in the Second Continental Congress where they finally decided they had to fight for their rights. In the beginning, not for independence, just for their rights. And finally, after that march on Lexington, where upwards of 95 Americans were killed in Lexington, Concord, and on the way back, about 95 were killed. A little later, 500 Americans were killed or wounded on Breed's Hill, which is called the Battle of Bunker's Hill. There was no alternative but to stand up, raise an army, and withstand this opposition. And as you know, Washington, of course, was nominated by John Adams of Boston to come up to Boston and save them. Well, Washington had only been in Boston once before, and when he arrived there to take over the troops, they were just state militia. They weren't really, what should we say, a qualified, trained army at all, but he tried to train them. And he only had until, 3 or 4 months to train them because they had only enlisted, for a little while. And by December, they all left. Washington said, "I wish I'd never seen the Continental Army." Well, they weren't to be seen anymore. They'd all gone home. They broke out in dysentery and they had some problems. And he only had a handful by December. And he really didn't know what to do about it. So he just stayed there. But in January, they all came back. Couldn't believe it. Went home for Christmas, ate the goose. They all come back, want to know when the war starts. Well, Washington now knew that maybe he could liberate Boston. And so what he did was to take a cannon over northeast of Boston and fire it. And, of course, General Howe thought that's where the attack was going to become, as Washington was going to liberate Boston that was occupied by the British troops. And during the night, he went over on Dorchester Heights at the other corner and planted 59 cannons in about 40 inches of frozen ground. So that when General Howe woke up the next morning to sort of take a good stretch, he went out, looked up at Dorchester Heights, and he couldn't believe his eyes. Every house in Boston was within range of those cannons. And then he looked out at the ships. Every ship in the harbor was within range of those cannons. The book says he looked at the ships, he looked at the city, he looked back up at the cannons, and he said, "Checkmate. I've been outgeneraled." And he prepared to abandon Boston. And so on March the 17th, all of the British had left. And Washington said, this was St. Patrick's Day. It was a great day to enter Boston for the Irish. And George Washington said, "Enter Boston and go to church and thank God we liberated Boston without the shedding of blood." That's Washington. Now, Washington knew that the next battle would be New York, and he knew he would lose it. He lost 5,000 men, but he had to show resistance or the whole war was over. The great Navy, which was the biggest Navy in the world, moved in around New York, and it was just a question of time until it had been taken. And Washington fled to White Plains up above New York. And so the English said, well, that's the end of that. He'll go home. His troops have all gone home. We saw them. And so they started putting their furniture back on the boat, ready to go back to England. And then the message came, Washington didn't go home. 3,000 men stayed with him. He's headed down across New Jersey toward Philadelphia. And General Howe said, the stupid man, he's supposed to go home. It's supposed to be over. Doesn't he know that he's beaten? Washington went down and camped on the far side of the Delaware River. Got himself about 5,000 more volunteers. And on Christmas night, you remember, he crossed. It was so cold, 2 of his men froze to death. And in the early morning hours, he captured Trenton with 1,000 Hessian troops. And when General Howe heard about it, he said, doesn't this man know that you don't fight in the winter? I mean, it isn't cricket, after all. And so he said to Cornwallis, who was down at Princeton, just a few miles away, you go in and punish Washington. We're not going to fight until spring. Punish him. And so, when Cornwallis arrived, guess what he saw? All along the banks of the Delaware River, huge bonfire, where the Washington camp apparently was situated. Oh, he said, foolish man. He's got his back to the river. We'll take him early in the morning. We'll have a good night's rest. We'll have a nice breakfast, and we'll go out and take him. And the next morning they got up to go out and take him, and guess what? There was nothing there but ashes of campfire. No Washington. Where was Washington? He'd gone around in the night back to Princeton that Cornwallis had just left and took it. Captured it. That was Washington. He was a great general. He had never had this many men to general before. If you read his book, you'll think that he didn't have any control over them, and it didn't seem like they had any support from Congress or from the states. But the bottom line is they won. They won. It was almost unbelievable how they did it, but they won. And as I say, 67 times Washington wrote to Congress and said, had not God intervened in our behalf, we would have failed. He felt very close to God most of his life. Now, all of you know that the Americans lost a lot of wars. They lost Philadelphia ultimately, and the British occupied it. Washington had sent most of his army north to help capture Burgoyne, which was a success, but it left Washington weak, and he lost 2 battles trying to fight General Howe, but General Howe finally took Philadelphia, and Washington had to go in with his army of about 8,000 men into Valley Forge. Almost immediately, a couple or 3,000 abandoned. There was no food. There were no adequate clothes. Only 1/3 of the troops had coats. And he put them to work cutting down logs so that they could build little cabins for those that didn't have clothes. He pleaded with the states to send clothes and food and assistance. Some reason or another didn't come. He watched 2,000 of his men die from starvation and disease. For 6 weeks they had nothing but fire cakes, flour, water, salt, morning, noon, night, flour, water, salt. And they began to break out with scurvy and with other diseases, and he watched them be buried by the hundreds. And there's a tradition, we don't have any record of it, but there's a tradition that on one occasion after 200 of his officers had just resigned and gone home, along with several thousand of his men, the few remaining men went to George Washington to tell him the American people didn't deserve this much suffering. They weren't helping enough. And they couldn't find Washington, and according to the tradition, they located him out in the woods alone. And he was praying out loud. Then the tradition says that he was saying, "Oh God, this is not my battle, it is thine. Keep enough of my men with me so we have a semblance of an army, so that if the French decide to come, we'll have the strength to stay free." And when the men heard him pray, they didn't say anything to him. They just crept back to the camp and told the soldiers they just had to stay with the general a little longer. And in just a few more weeks, the good word came that 2 French fleets were on the way with several thousand troops to help. And all of you know that it was a question of time until the proper direction by Washington led to victory at Yorktown. I think it's marvelous that Washington then went before the Congress and resigned his commission right at the time that his soldiers wanted to make him the king of America. He was so loved and so admired and so respected for his tenacity and holding when everyone else seemed to have been discouraged and gone home. His men wanted to make him king of America. And he wrote to them, he called in his officers, and he said, "This is not the way to go. We're almost home. The Congress isn't adequate, but we just got to strengthen it somehow. We haven't set up the right kind of government yet, but we must not go back to a monarchy." And he resigned and went home and arrived there Christmas Day in the year 1783, and went back to his fields. His whole plantation had fallen apart in the 6.5 years that he'd been gone, and so he started to put it together again. And then word came that the whole United States was falling apart. The states were beginning to treat each other like enemies. You wanted to go from Connecticut to Massachusetts, you got to go through customs. You want to go then down to New York, you got to go through customs. Then Pennsylvania, you got to go through customs. In fact, the word came that all of New England was about to secede. And New York said, "Good riddance." And the South said, "We could do without either one of you." Spain was moving up and beginning to take territory along the Mississippi. England wouldn't even take her troops home from the northern border. Washington said, "If anybody had told me that after all of our suffering, our great nation would just disintegrate and become disunited so soon after our great victory, I would have thought they were a candidate for an insane asylum." But it's happening. We're getting riots in the streets, inflation. No one knows what money's worth anymore. That sound familiar? And he began to wonder if they were going to be able to do what he felt God wanted them to do. And that was to remain a great and united people. And so he began urging that there be a constitutional convention. You know, he had more to do with that convention than anybody. And when Congress finally agreed to hold it, and they were very reluctant about even calling it, it looked as though Washington wouldn't be able to go. His brother had just died. His mother was very ill and not expected to live. And a sister looked as though she might not survive either. Furthermore, Washington was so full of rheumatism from being in camp life and exposed to the elements, he couldn't even sleep at night. He was in so much pain. And so he said, I don't think I'll be able to go as a delegate from Virginia. And Madison wrote and said, General, if you don't come, there will be no constitutional convention. You're the only one the country trusts sufficiently to accept the fruits of what we bring forth. We must have you here if you have to come on a stretcher. And so he strapped his right arm to his chest so he could endure the pain in his shoulder and in his arm, and took a carriage and got to Philadelphia. And then the next thing he knew, they'd made him the president of the convention. And only recently we've discovered that the Constitution we finally received was primarily Washington's handiwork. He didn't give any speeches. He only spoke once in the whole convention. Of course, he was presiding over most of the time, but he could have spoken if he'd wished. But only once did he speak. Most of the time he was counseling at luncheon, at supper. He was calling them to his home. And we now know that many of the mistakes that the others would have made, Washington guided them away, and then let them introduce it and let them debate it and take credit for it. He did it quietly behind the scenes, and we finally got this marvelous document called the Constitution of the United States. And much of it can be credited to this great man who was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Those words come from one of his own officers, Henry Lee. Now, a fantastic thing happened after the Constitution got into operation. The founders themselves knew that it was brand new. It had to be tried out. The states themselves insisted there be a Bill of Rights that had been left out of the original Constitution, and it was Washington that said to them, go ahead and accept the Constitution. I guarantee that if I'm elected president, which everybody knew he would be, we'll get the Bill of Rights in there. And so they did. It was Washington, Jefferson, men like Madison, etc., who initiated an attempt to get rid of slavery right then. And then they thought, well, that would be totally disruptive to the economy if it was done that suddenly. We'll give them 20 years to phase it out. Washington was most anxious that they eliminate slavery, and so were most of the delegates from Virginia. So they gave 20 years in the Constitution to phase out slavery. Unfortunately, that did not occur, and as a result, we had the terrible war between the states a little later on. But these men stood for principles that were way out in front of almost everybody. And now I have kind of a sad story to tell. Beginning around 1900, there were those who said that the American Constitution wasn't exactly the form of government for a modern industrial society. They said, let's kind of abandon all this individual freedom and states' rights and move toward a collectivist federalization. And that's when it began to be advocated, about 1900. And gradually that's been taking over. You've got a problem? Go to Washington. Washington has all the answers. The founding fathers have warned against this. And so we find ourselves in this year of the 249th year, memorializing the birth date of George Washington, a whole series of problems that those great men anticipated and told us how to avoid. And so America is waking up. All of those theories and philosophies that they gave us as substitute formulas have turned out to be failure formulas. And now people are saying, let's go back and look at the thinking of Washington and Jefferson and Madison and John Adams and Sam Adams again. So in 1971, several of us got together and took the Founding Fathers' formula and put it into a structure called the Miracle of America and started teaching it. Well, only a few people paid attention at first. And we called our program the Freeman Institute because the founders called themselves freemen. before they called themselves Americans. And gradually it began to catch on. And I'm so thrilled today that we're not only in practically all of the states of the United States now, teaching the miracle of America, but I just returned from Canada. And they have just organized a Freeman Institute of Canada. And 13 other countries have said, will you come over and tell us the American founding fathers' original formula? And as fast as we're able, we're going to spread that message all over the world. Of course, it's most essential that we reestablish it here. And so we're going to hold seminars here locally for those of you who are near Los Angeles. Well, I pray that God will bless the memory of this great person whose memory we celebrate. I'm glad that 200 years of scholarship couldn't find a scandal because George Washington's father wanted him to be good as well as great. And I'm proud of him as an example to tell my children about, that he was not only a great man, but a good man. Not that he might not have had human frailties, but they must have been minimal because hardly anybody recorded anything that was negative about this man. His frame was straight like an arrow, and so was his character. And so I close by saying, God bless the memory of George Washington and all the things he stood for, and God bless us that we may have the courage and the inspiration to restore the things they stood for, that we and our children may remain forever free as they fought to preserve it in their day. May we work to preserve it in ours. Thank you.